Let's film in loads of locations, Josie. That's a great idea. Hey there, Poetry Pals. Welcome back to another video. This week, I'll be telling you how to write a poetry collection. Hey, that's right, my name's Josie. I did 2 degrees in English literature and creative writing, so you don't have to, and I share my knowledge on the internet for free. My first poetry collection is coming out spring 2023, and I'm making a series of videos about how to publish a poetry collection. This video, we're going to be talking about how to write one. But before we go any further, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. The engagement really helps small creators like me get found. So make sure you comment as well what brought you here, and if you have any questions about the publishing process as well. While we're on the subject, why don't you follow me on social media? I am at Josie Alford Poet on all the things. And if you want to support the channel because you found this video incredibly useful and you want to support me with your money, then you can buy me a coffee or join me on Patreon. The links to do both are in the description down below. Ding. So here's how this video is going to work. I'm going to talk through the process of writing a poetry collection. If you're here to learn about like the editing process or the submitting process, you're going to have to subscribe, turn on notifications and come back later. But I also asked my followers on social media their questions about the writing process, and I'll be answering those as we go through. Okay, so there are basically 2 steps in writing a poetry collection. But before we get into it, I'm going to answer the first question I got asked, which is by my husband, Trey, who's filming. Say hi, Trey. Hello. The question was, what is a collection and what is a pamphlet, and what is the difference between them? Now, I've answered this in other videos, but I think it is relevant here. And the answer is just number of pages. So a pamphlet will be 20 to 30 pages long, maybe up to 40, and a collection will be at least 60 pages long. Depending how long your poems are, that depends how many poems are in each one. So the 2 steps are come up with a concept and write loads and loads of poems. Obviously the number of poems that you write depends on whether you're writing a pamphlet or a collection, but it's always best to write more so you can cut back to just the golden ones. So for me, I tend to write concept first. So I'm going to talk about step 1, coming up with a concept first. When I say concept, I mean, what's the reason for this collection being a collection? And there are many ways to do this. We have writing around a theme, writing about a place, a person, a time or an experience, or you can tell a story, or you could write a load of similar poems, like a load of poems in a similar form. For example, a collection of sonnets. Or you could write one long poem that is a collection length poem. You might choose to write a load of poems first and then find the theme afterwards, which is what a lot of people do, especially spoken word artists who've been writing for years. And if you have been writing for years and you haven't published yet, you might have a huge backlog of poems that you're like, why don't I just make a collection out of these? In which case you read them through, you pick which ones are going to go through them, you probably edit them to make them a little better, and you structure them into a collection. But we'll cover editing and stuff like that later. Pascal asked, how do you personally establish a through line through the collection? I'm really glad they asked because I love talking about myself. My first collection, which is out in March, is about my dad passing away. And the reason I chose that as a theme or an event to write about was actually because I was in the middle of doing a master's and I had to write a lot of poetry. So that was what was on my mind. I had a deadline for a lot of poems. This collection was born. After the master's was done, I continued to write about it, and then came a full collection rather than a pamphlet. Collection number 2, I've also come up with the theme first, but you're gonna have to wait for that one. And buy my first book, please. So before we move on to step number 2, which is writing a load of poems, I just want to cover another question, which was also by husband Trey. Say hi, Trey.
Hello.
And the question was, does it have to have a concept? And the answer is no, but established poets release like random collections of poetry that have no uniting theme all the time. They call them selected poems or new and selected poems, which is when they just get a load of old poems that they've written before, stick it in a book and sell it. This works when you've got a big name in poetry and people just want to buy your stuff. But for newer and brand new poets, I don't think just a random collection of poems work. I think having a united theme helps. Not just for the writing of it, but also, to be quite cynical, the selling and marketing of it as well. Being able to say, this is a poetry collection about this, it covers this, this and this, really helps when it comes to talking about your book and convincing people to buy it. Which, at the end of the day, isn't that why we're writing poetry? Not necessarily to make money, obviously, but for other people to read it. So having a clear concept is a good way of convincing people to read your poems. So step number 2, or this might be your step number 1, is to write a load of poems. Easy, right? Well, not necessarily. And actually for me, that's the bit that I find the hardest. So just to be clear, if you want to learn how to write a poem or individual poems, that's not what this section is going to be about. This is about sort of maintaining that discipline and writing poems to the amount that you would have written a whole collection. If you want to learn how to write individual poems, you can watch my playlist here. I've got loads of videos on how to write all different forms of poetry, so go check that out. So my number 1 piece of advice is to develop a discipline. Don't wait for inspiration to arrive. Work writing regularly into your routine, as regularly as possible. Most of my poems begin as free writes anyway, which tends to take the pressure off and makes procrastinating about writing a poem a little bit easier. Because if all I've got to do is write for 15 minutes without stopping and it doesn't have to be good, that really takes the pressure off. And then later, when I'm in the mood to actually create poems, I can go back to my free writes and use them as material with which to build a poem. Which brings me to Rasheen's question, which is, where do you find inspiration? So I actually like to follow poetry prompts online. These are really, really useful, especially when you're struggling with stuff to write about, using poetry prompts online. Or in previous videos, I have shown you my 654 things to write about book, which is a really good place to start if I've got nothing on the noggin. But like most poets, I find inspiration pretty much everywhere as well. Places, people, the smell of a particular place, snatches of overheard conversation, beer, wine, tea, food, music, the wind, the sea, passing killer whales, and of course the unhinged ramblings of my anxiety brain the minute I try and fall asleep. Now, whenever those inspirations strike, it might not be the most convenient time to sit down and write a poem then and there, but what I tend to do is I leave myself a note to come back to it later. So I will either have a notebook to hand or I will just put it in the notes out of my phone. So when I have time, I will come back and write the poem that those lines inspired. Lucy asked, would love to know how to keep going. My latest collection has stalled. How do you keep it fresh? This is a fairly commonish question, I guess, the older writer's block that no one talks about. Sometimes it's just you get in the middle of a project and the excitement was there at the beginning, but now you're flagging. And I think it's just about this is where the discipline comes in, right? Take off the pressure of anything you write having to be any good and just get writing and write a lot. And statistically, something that you find, something that you write will be good. So I think head back to just doing free writes all the time. Join a sort of poetry writing challenge, like writing every day for 30 days or something like that. And going to poetry workshops as well. All of these have been mixtures that have helped me write the collection that is coming out next year. One of my favourite poems, actually, my favourite poem of the whole collection, which comes at the end, was actually written during a poetry workshop that was run by my good friend Beth Calverley at the Arnesvale Cemetery. So that's nice. But yeah, that is definitely one of my favourite poems of all time, and that was just from going to a poetry workshop and supporting my friend, thinking, oh yeah, I'll go along, that'll be nice, and I ended up writing one of my favourite poems of all time. So yeah, workshops, poetry prompts, challenges, discipline. Get on it. Start with free writes. Get the first draft, take the pressure off. It doesn't have to be good, it just has to be. One of the most famous poetry writing challenges is NaPoWriMo. Now, by the time that this comes out, you, if you are an author, might be preparing for NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. This is where novelists get together and they decide to write a certain number of thousand words every day towards their work in progress. NaPoWriMo is exactly the same, except you write one poem every day and it's during April. You should join that. It's useful. And I think these online hashtag challenges, you don't actually have to share your poetry, but it is useful having a online community to rev you up and keep you going, which is great. I suggest sharing 1 or 2 lines. Why not? Treat yourself. Okay, so in this section, I'm just answering a few of the Q&As of followers that have asked me questions about writing a poetry collection. Here we go. Do you write a certain number of words, or is it number of poems? As I said earlier in the video, it's actually to do with the number of pages. So if your poems are really short and it's sort of one poem would fit on one A5-ish page, then yes, it's the number of poems. But if you happen to be writing really long poems, then it would be less poems, but it's still based on the number of pages. As I said, a chapbook is sort of 20 to 40 pages, and then a poetry collection is sort of 60 plus. The same person asked me, can you use stuff you've already written? And the answer is yes, of course you can. But you cannot use stuff that's already been published. And by published, I mean as part of a collection. If an individual poem has been published in a magazine or journal, then it's fine to be used as part of your collection. You just have to include it in the acknowledgements page. Poems or previous versions of poems have appeared in the following publications, and then you have your acknowledgements page there. But if you've published a poem as a previously published collection, you can't publish it again. There's sort of all the copyright issues. Another question I got was, how long does it take? And I guess the answer to this is, how long is a piece of string? It took me, from the first poem I wrote to the last poem I wrote, probably took me about 3 years to write this poetry collection in total. But I was doing a lot of living and stuff alongside that. This links to a question from Pascal, who asked, should you give yourself a deadline? Should you give yourself a timeline of how long to work on it? You can do, if deadlines work to help you be more creative, but I'm not sure that it works. Personally, when I've used deadlines to finish the collection, it's more to do with, I've already written most of it, or I've already edited and got it all together. There's just a couple of poems that need work. And then I use the submission deadlines of whichever publisher I'm submitting to get it to a place where I'm ready to submit. That's how I set deadlines. I didn't necessarily say, I want this published by this time. So, can if you want, if you're motivated by deadlines. If deadlines scare you, don't do that. That's what I'd say. How do you decide which style each poem is going to be? And it's quite interesting actually, because I was having this discussion on Twitter. For me, all of my poems start as free writes. So I just give myself 15 minutes, write on the subject, see whatever. And then once I go back and read through it, that's when I decide, okay, this poem is feeling like this. Shall it be a sonnet? Shall it be a free verse? Shall it rhyme? It never rhymes. But for me. So yeah, that's how I decide on what style a poem is going to be, is it starts off as not even having line breaks, and then I decide from there. So Hannah asked, and Hannah was one of my fellow students on the MA in creative writing from Bath Spa, although she specialised in prose writing, whereas I was one of the poets. And she asks, is there any skills from the MA you use, or have you found real world experience trumps it? I'm going to say both. It was a combination of both that I found really useful, especially when it came to writing an entire collection, mainly because the MA itself was focused on you writing your manuscript, right? So like, it was all focused around getting you to the point of developing one work in progress, one book, one collection, and bringing it all together. And so that's why I think that was really useful. I also learned a lot on the MA about the publishing world, how it works, how to get individual poems published in journals and magazines and stuff like that, and how that can help you when applying for publication. However, there were definitely some real world experience that has helped me a lot as well. I actually worked with Burning Eye for 6 months as marketing, and I have been working in the sort of spoken word events industry? No. I've been working in spoken word events for a really long time. I've been around poetry for a lot longer before I was doing the MA, so I learned a lot about more how indie presses work and stuff like that from real world experience, whereas the MA taught me a lot about how sort of traditional publishing works. And knowing both has been useful. However, does that mean that I advocate that everyone should get several £1,000s in debt to go and do an MA? No, because you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for free. You can watch all of my videos, because literally all of my videos are knowledge that I learned in my MA. So you're welcome. So that's it for this week's video. I hope you found it useful on writing a poetry collection. In the next videos, we're going to talk about editing a poetry collection. We're also going to talk about submitting it to a publisher, choosing a publisher. I'm also going to have a book cover reveal, and at some point I will be making a video about the time between acceptance and publication and what happens in that process. Because to be honest, that was something I wasn't that sure about before. So this is really cool. I hope you found it useful. Please subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss a single update, and comment down below any questions that you have about the rest of the process, and I'll make sure to answer them in upcoming videos. Can I explicitly ask for questions to my illustrator, because I will be interviewing my illustrator on how it was designing my book cover. So if you want to ask her any questions, drop them in the comments and I'll make sure to ask her when we do the interview. My next video will be out in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, why don't you follow me on social media? I am at Josie Alford Poet on all the things. And at the moment, I am traveling around New Zealand in a camper van, which is why I've had to rely on filming in public. Hate it. If you found this particularly useful and you want to show your support using your wallet, you can buy me a coffee or join me on Patreon. The links to do both are in the description down below. And let me tell you, New Zealand is more expensive than I thought, so you might have. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you all next week. Bye.